Imagine a world shrouded in shadow, where the streets of once bustling cities lay eerily silent, and the air itself seems to carry a whisper of death. Sit back, relax, and allow yourself to step into the year 1347, a time when Europe teetered on the edge of an unimaginable catastrophe. Ships creaked into port from distant lands, their hulls laden not just with goods, but with a deadly passenger fleas carrying a microscopic horror that would unravel the very fabric of society. Some historians estimate that nearly half of Europe's population would vanish within a few short years, leaving towns empty, fields untended, and families broken beyond repair. The Black Death, as it would come to be known, was more than a disease. It was a force that reshaped the world, redefining the boundaries of life and death. Imagine the toll on everyday existence: markets deserted, the stench of decay rising from homes where entire households succumbed, priests unable to administer last rites fast enough to keep pace with the relentless march of the plague. Scholars and doctors of the time were powerless, their most sophisticated remedies herbs, leeches, prayers, subtly ineffective against this invisible enemy. Some researchers believe that the disease spread faster along the trade routes of the Mediterranean and the Silk Road, a testament to the interconnectedness of the medieval world, while others suggest that climatic shifts, malnutrition, and war-weakened populations created a perfect storm for catastrophe. The plague did not discriminate. Nobles, peasants, merchants, and clergy all fell under its shadow, and society itself began to wobble as the workforce dwindled. Grain rotted in the fields, and the certainty of life's continuity evaporated. But beyond the horror, there is a strange fascination in understanding how humanity responded to such calamity, how the seeds of modern medicine, social structure, and even labor rights began to emerge from the ashes. From one port to another, from one village to the next, the Black Death advanced like a spectre with no face, leaving questions that still echo through history. Why did it strike so ruthlessly? And what hidden vulnerabilities did it expose in the societies of the time? And as we explore the events that unfolded over these fateful years, you may find yourself asking, what could a single microscopic organism teach us about the fragility and resilience of the human world? The answers lie ahead, hidden in the shadows of an era that would never be the same as the Black Death crept from port to village. Its presence was first marked by small, almost innocuous signs: a swollen lymph node here, a fever there. The telltale black blotches beneath the skin that would give the plague its ominous name. Imagine the terror as people began to understand that these were not ordinary illnesses, that the sickness carried a certainty of death that no candle, no herb, no prayer could deter. Some believed the plague to be a punishment from God, a fiery reckoning for sins committed by mankind, while others whispered of more sinister causes: poisoned wells, miasmas rising from the earth, invisible agents of destruction that could not be seen, only feared. Entire families were forced to isolate themselves, sometimes barricading themselves in their homes, hoping to escape the invisible hunter stalking the streets. Yet the disease showed no mercy, and soon entire neighborhoods were reduced to ghost towns, doors left ajar, meals left uneaten, and the wails of the dying filling the air like a mournful symphony. In towns where the plague struck hardest, burial grounds overflowed, with hastily dug pits swallowing the bodies of the afflicted faster than the clergy could offer blessings. Some chroniclers speak of the silence that followed a quiet, broken only by the wind rustling through empty streets, the cawing of crows circling above, drawn to the carnage below. It was a world where the rules of life and survival were rewritten in real time, where superstition and desperation walked hand in hand with the stark, biological reality of the plague. Merchants abandoned trade. Farmers left fields untended, and yet, strangely, the collapse also offered glimpses of adaptation communities seeking new ways to survive. Neighbors helping neighbors in unexpected acts of humanity amidst overwhelming despair. Scholars today debate the exact origins of the Black Death. Some trace it to the arid plains of Central Asia, carried westward by rats aboard merchant caravans, while others suggest multiple, simultaneous outbreaks across continents. What is certain is that the disease forced a confrontation with mortality on a scale never seen before, challenging humans to reckon with their own fragility. And as we move next to explore how the Black Death reshaped economies, power, and social order, one question lingers in the shadows. How could a single unseen agent wield such absolute control over the fate of an entire world? It is this paradox, this delicate dance between vulnerability and survival, that would define the centuries to come. To understand the Black Death's arrival, we must trace its path backward, across oceans and deserts, through the arteries of medieval trade that connected east and west. Picture the bustling markets of the Silk Road, where spices, silks, and stories flowed between worlds' end along with them. Something far more sinister. Some researchers point to the Tian Shan Mountains of Central Asia as the plague's birthplace, where a subtle shift in climate may have disrupted rodent populations, forcing their fleas to seek new hosts, camels, horses, and eventually humans. From there, caravans carried the unseen threat westward, stopping at outposts where merchants bartered and soldiers rested, allowing the infection to leap from one camp to the next. By the mid-1340s, the plague reached the Black Sea port of Kaffa, a Genoese trading hub that became the site of a grim legend, the siege where Mongol forces, stricken by plague themselves, purportedly catapulted the bodies of the dead over the city's walls, turning biological catastrophe into a weapon of war. Whether this account is fact or embellishment, one thing is clear: ships leaving Kaffa carried more than grain and goods. Inside their dark, rat-infested holds, fleas waited, hungry and infected, ready to leap onto new victims the moment the ships docked. Imagine the scene as these vessels arrived in Messina, Sicily, in 1347, sailors disembarking sick, some already dead, the docks filling with rumors of a strange illness that killed faster than any fever known to man. From Sicily, the plague fanned out like wildfire, crossing into Italy's thriving cities. Genoa, Venice, places where narrow streets, crowded markets, and constant trade created the perfect storm for transmission. Within months, the disease had become unstoppable, radiating northward through France into Spain, and eventually crossing the English Channel aboard trading ships, sealing England's fate. The plague traveled not just along roads and rivers, but in the very breath of the infected, passing silently between coughs, sneezes, and desperate whispers. Its spread was relentless, its pace terrifying, leaving behind a grim map of death that seemed to paint all of Europe in black. And as the disease advanced, panic followed. Who could stop an enemy too small to see, too fast to contain? What prayers, what walls, what armies could turn back the tide? This was no ordinary disaster, it was a reordering of the medieval world, and its shadow had only just begun to fall. As the Black Death advanced, its presence became impossible to ignore, not just for the death it brought, but for the terror it inspired. Imagine being a peasant in a small French village. Waking one morning to find your neighbor's door nailed shut, the family inside already gone, and by evening hearing that the next village over has lost half its people in a single week. Fear moved faster than the disease itself, spreading through whispers, through desperate prayers, through the hollow eyes of those who had seen the worst and fled. Physicians of the time, clad in long robes and strange beaked masks stuffed with herbs, moved from house to house, attempting to shield themselves from the invisible poison in the air. These figures became symbols of dread, their very arrival a sign that death was near. The remedies they offered, bleeding, burning aromatic woods, smearing concoctions of herbs, brought little relief, and in many cases, death seemed to come faster after such desperate treatments. Some towns tried to protect themselves by closing their gates to travelers, posting guards at their borders, but the plague slipped through cracks, carried by a single rat, a single bite, a single cough. In cities like Florence, the death toll was so high that bodies were piled into carts and taken to mass graves, the earth unable to swallow the dead quickly enough. Chroniclers wrote of a silence that followed, a deep, unnatural quiet that blanketed entire neighborhoods, broken only by the sound of wheels creaking as corpses were hauled away. For some, this was a sign of divine judgment, and they turned to flagellation, public acts of whipping themselves in penance, believing that by suffering they might appease God and turn away his wrath. Others looked for scapegoats, accusing outsiders, strangers, and particularly Jewish communities of poisoning wells, leading to horrific waves of persecution that killed thousands who had nothing to do with the disease. The plague, in its merciless sweep, did more than kill. It unmasked the deepest fears and prejudices of medieval society. And still it came, village after village, city after city, its reach seeming almost supernatural. How could something so small cause devastation so total? How could life collapse so quickly? These were the questions echoing in the hearts of those who survived, as they watched their world crumble and waited, wondering who among them would be next. By the time the Black Death reached the heart of Europe, its impact had become impossible to measure in mere numbers. Imagine the once bustling markets of Paris falling silent, the chatter of merchants replaced by the clatter of death carts rolling down cobblestone streets. In England, chroniclers recorded entire villages disappearing, fields lying abandoned, and livestock wandering untended because no one remained to care for them. The plague struck rich and poor alike, but its effect on society was uneven. Lords and nobles who survived suddenly found their estates empty of workers, while peasants who lived found themselves with a strange, grim opportunity. With labor scarce, surviving farmers and craftsmen could demand higher wages, better living conditions, and even freedom from the feudal obligations that had tied them to the land for generations. Some historians see this as the first crack in the rigid social structure of medieval Europe, a subtle shift that would, over time, dismantle the feudal system and pave the way for a more modern economy. But not all was opportunity. Fare still ruled. People avoided gatherings, festivals, even church services, convinced that proximity to others invited death. Trade slowed to a crawl, ports closed, and the great networks of commerce that had made Europe prosperous became conduits of terror. Letters and chronicles from the time speak of a strange sense of timelessness, as though the normal rhythm of the year-planting harvest, feast days, had been suspended under the weight of the plague. Even nature seemed to join in the calamity, with storms, floods, and poor harvests, deepening the sense that the world itself had turned against humanity. And yet, survival bred resilience. Those who lived through the plague carried its memory like a scar, shaping their choices and their beliefs for the rest of their lives. Artists began to paint macabre scenes of skeletons dancing among the living, a grim reminder that death was never far away. Priests preached of repentance, urging people to prepare their souls at every moment. The plague had become more than an event. It was a lens through which the living viewed every aspect of existence. And as we move forward, we must ask, could a disaster so vast also be a catalyst for transformation, pushing Europe toward the dawn of a new age? The answer lies in the decades that followed, when the world began to rebuild from its deepest wound. When the plague finally loosened its grip, it left behind a Europe that no longer looked or felt the same. Imagine walking through a city like Florence in the early 1350 streets, once filled with noise and laughter, now haunted by empty houses, boarded windows, and overgrown gardens where weeds pushed through the cracks of abandoned courtyards. Survivors moved cautiously through this new world, carrying both relief and a deep, lingering dread, as if the shadow of the plague might return at any moment. And in many places it did, reappearing in waves for centuries, reminding everyone that death was never fully vanquished. The population collapse had far-reaching effects, with fewer mouths to feed. Grain prices fell, allowing some survivors to eat better than before. Land, once scarce, became available to those who had never owned it, changing the balance of power in villages and towns. Yet the psychological toll was harder to mend. People struggled to make sense of what had happened, turning to faith, to superstition, and to art as ways to process the devastation. Churches, once overwhelmed with burials, now became centers of remembrance, filled with candles for the dead and frescoes depicting the dance of death, grim processions of skeletons leading kings, peasants, and children alike into the afterlife, a reminder that no one could escape mortality. Some scholars believe this obsession with death and fate influenced the birth of the Renaissance, as people sought not only to prepare for the next world, but to savor and understand this one. The plague had also struck down countless clergy, leaving a vacuum of spiritual authority that allowed new religious movements and ideas to take root. For some, this was liberating, a chance to question old hierarchies and seek a more personal relationship with God, while for others, it was frightening, a sign that the order of the universe had been shattered. Across Europe, the survivors faced a paradox. They had lived through the end of the world, and now they had to build something new from its ashes. And so we must wonder, did the Black Death merely destroy, or did it also plant the seeds of transformation, forcing humanity to confront its fragility and, in doing so, to grow stronger? In the next part of our journey, we explore how this great mortality reshaped medicine, science, and the way people understood the body itself. The Black Death did not just devastate populations, it challenged everything people thought they knew about health, the human body, and the invisible forces that governed life. Picture the physicians of the 14th century, their knowledge rooted in ancient texts from Galen and Hippocrates, struggling to explain an illness that seemed to defy every rule they had been taught. The common belief was that the plague spread through miasma, bad air thick with corruption, rising from swamps or the breath of the sick. To combat this, people carried posies of herbs, burned fragrant woods, and walked through the streets clutching cloths soaked in vinegar to purify the air they breathed. Some doctors recommended bloodletting, believing that removing corrupted blood might rebalance the body's humors, while others advised avoiding baths altogether, thinking that open pores invited the pestilence in. In hindsight, these treatments did little, and in some cases worsened the patient's suffering. but they revealed the desperate attempt to impose order on an incomprehensible catastrophe. Interestingly, some researchers today suggest that this crisis laid the foundation for a shift toward observation and record-keeping in medicine. Chroniclers began carefully documenting symptoms, timing of outbreaks, and mortality rates, creating a body of knowledge that future physicians could study. These were the first steps toward epidemiology, the science of tracking diseases, even if the true causa bacterium carried by fleas would not be discovered for centuries. The plague also forced cities to experiment with public health measures on a scale never seen before. Quarantine, derived from the Italian word quarantino, meaning 40 days, was first implemented in Venetian ports, where ships were required to wait offshore before their crew could disembark. Some towns established pest houses outside their walls where the infected were sent, an early attempt at isolating cases to protect the healthy. These measures were harsh, sometimes cruel, but they reflected a dawning realization that disease could be managed, perhaps even contained, if communities acted together. And so the Black Death became both a tragedy and a teacher, forcing medieval Europe to think about disease not as random punishment, but as something that could be studied, controlled, and one day prevented. But this awakening came at a terrible cost, and as we will see next, the social and psychological scars it left behind were as deep as the mass graves that dotted the landscape. The psychological weight of the Black Death was heavier than any tombstone, pressing down on the minds of those who survived and reshaping their view of life itself. Imagine living through months where death was not an abstract idea, but a constant companion, lurking in every touch, every cough, every shadowed corner of the street. Survivors emerged from the plague, years haunted, changed, and often deeply fearful of the future. Chroniclers wrote of a new obsession with mortality, churchyards filled with frescoes depicting skeletons leading kings, merchants, and peasants in the same grim procession known as the Dance of Death, a visual reminder that no one could escape the grave's call. Even music and poetry took on a darker tone, as if the world itself was in mourning. The trauma ran deeper than grief alone. It fractured trust. Neighbors became suspicious of one another, fearful that the disease might still be passed from house to house. Communities that had once gathered for festivals and feast days became cautious, hesitant to mix, as if joy itself had become dangerous. This suspicion also turned outward, targeting groups already on the margins of society. Jewish communities across Europe were accused of causing the plague by poisoning wells, leading to pogroms that claimed thousands of innocent lives. Outsiders, travelers, and even lepers were persecuted, often burned or expelled from towns in an attempt to purge the imagined source of infection. This dark chapter reveals how fear can turn quickly into violence, and how, in times of crisis, humanity's search for answers can become a hunt for scapegoats. Yet, within this darkness, there were also flickers of compassion and resilience. Some religious orders dedicated themselves to caring for the sick and burying the dead, even at the cost of their own lives. Acts of charity grew in some places, as survivors endowed hospitals, churches, and almshouses in memory of those lost. The plague had stripped society bare, revealing its cruelest impulses but also its capacity for renewal. And so we are left with a question that lingers like incense in a cold church. Did the Black Death break medieval Europe, or did it forge something new out of the ashes of despair? In the next section, we follow how this upheaval rippled outward, shaking governments, economies, and even the authority of the church itself. The Black Death did not merely kill individuals. It struck at the very pillars of medieval society, shaking institutions that had seemed immovable for centuries. Imagine the great cathedrals of Europe, once filled with choirs and the smell of incense, now nearly empty, their priests dead or fled, leaving their congregations spiritually adrift. The church, which had promised protection and salvation, suddenly seemed powerless. Its prayers unanswered, its rituals unable to hold back the tide of death. For many, this was a crisis of faith. Some turned to fanaticism, joining processions of flagellants who whipped themselves through the streets in desperate attempts to appease divine wrath. Others turned away entirely, growing cynical, believing that God had abandoned the world. This spiritual unrest weakened the church's grip on power, planting seeds of doubt that would one day grow into open calls for reform and, eventually, the Reformation. At the same time, governments struggled to maintain order, with tax bases collapsing and armies diminished by death. Kings and princes found themselves unable to enforce their will as they once had. In England, labour shortages gave peasants leverage, leading to demands for higher wages and, when those demands were resisted, rebellions like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 across Europe. The old feudal bonds began to loosen as serfs deserted their lords' lands to seek better opportunities elsewhere, or simply walked away, knowing there were too few authorities left to stop them. Some rulers tried to freeze wages or tie labourers back to the soil, but these measures often backfired, driving unrest and resentment even deeper. The Black Death had acted like a scythe, not just through bodies, but through the structures of power themselves, cutting away old certainties and leaving a vacuum that would have to be filled. Trade, too, was disrupted. Merchants who survived found new opportunities, buying land or entering politics, shifting wealth away from the aristocracy and toward a rising class of townsmen and traders. The world that emerged was more volatile, more flexible, and more open to change than the rigid order that had existed before. And so we must ask, was this great mortality simply an ending, or was it the first crack of thunder heralding a storm of transformation that would remake Europe forever? In the next section, we will explore how the economy itself was reshaped, and how scarcity gave birth to innovation in ways that no one could have foreseen. The economic world that followed the Black Death was almost unrecognizable compared to the one that had existed before, as if an invisible hand had swept the chessboard clean and reset the game. The sheer loss of life meant that entire villages stood abandoned, their fields untended, their mills silent, their market squares empty. Grain prices collapsed at first because there were fewer mouths to feed, but soon, as labour shortages became more severe, wages began to rise sharply. For the first time in living memory, peasants and craftsmen could bargain for better pay, knowing they were suddenly indispensable. Lords, desperate to harvest their crops, often had no choice but to agree. This redistribution of economic power caused quiet revolutions in household after household, as families who had once lived at the edge of starvation found themselves with more food, better clothing, and even a chance to purchase land. Some historians suggest this was the birth of a proto-middle class, a slow but steady shift away from the strictly feudal hierarchy that had dominated medieval Europe. But not everyone welcomed this change. Ruling elites passed laws, like England's Statute of Labourers, which attempted to cap wages at pre-plague levels and force workers to stay where they had been before. These measures only deepened resentment, leading to strikes, riots, and uprisings. The old order was fighting to reassert itself, but the plague had changed the game too drastically for things to go back to the way they were. Trade routes shifted as well, as cities struck by plague lost influence and new ones rose to take their place. Survivors with coin to spend created demand for goods like fine cloth, spices, and wine, fueling long-distance trade and laying the groundwork for the commercial expansion of the Renaissance. Even technology began to accelerate, as shortages of manual labor encouraged the adoption of devices like watermills, windmills, and improved plows. The Black Death had destroyed much, but in its wake, it seemed to force society to adapt, innovate, and reorganize. This raises a haunting paradox. Was the plague a destroyer, or was it darkly, brutally a catalyst for progress? In our next section, we step deeper into this paradox, looking at how culture, art, and literature began to change as Europe wrestled with the memory of so much death and dared to imagine something new in the shadow of the Black Death. Culture itself seemed to shift its tone, as if the entire continent was speaking in a new, darker language. Art became haunted by the skeletal figure, once a marginal symbol in religious manuscripts, moved to center stage. Frescoes and carvings began to depict the Danse Macabre, the grim dance in which kings, bishops, merchants, and beggars were all led by death's bony hand, each equal before the grave. Churches displayed chilling murals of decaying corpses and open graves, reminders to the faithful of life's fragility. This was not mere morbid fascination. It was a society processing collective trauma, translating unspeakable fear into imagery that everyone could see. Literature too was marked by the plague's shadow. Writers like Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the horror firsthand, captured the strangeness of a world where social order collapsed and pleasure became both an escape and a rebellion. His Decameron told the stories of 10 young people who fled the plague-ridden city of Florence and passed the time in storytelling, mixing humor, tragedy, and moral lessons. It was as though humanity, staring death in the face, had decided to speak more honestly about its desires, its vices, its hypocrisies. Music shifted as well, with compositions turning more somber, echoing the new preoccupation with mortality. But amid the darkness, a curious thing happened. This confrontation with death also ignited a hunger for beauty and knowledge. Wealthy survivors commissioned altarpieces and sculptures, not only to honor the dead, but to celebrate life and salvation. Patrons invested in universities and scholars, sparking a slow revival of classical learning that would eventually blossom into the Renaissance. It was as if Europe, scorched by suffering, sought to rebuild itself, not just physically, but spiritually and intellectually. This raises a question. Did the plague push humanity into despair, or did it shake it awake, forcing it to create something enduring from the ashes? The answer may lie in how ideas themselves began to spread faster, crossing borders and inspiring new ways of thinking. In our next section, we follow this intellectual current, tracing how the plague might have been one of the silent forces preparing the way for the scientific revolution and a new way of seeing the world. The Black Death was not only a tragedy, but also a teacher, though its lessons were written in suffering. For centuries, medicine in Europe had been bound to the theories of Galen and Hippocrates, relying on ideas of humors, astrology, and miasma, the notion that foul air carried sickness. But when the plague struck, these explanations suddenly felt hollow. Physicians, priests, and scholars watched as their remedies failed, and as leeches, purges, and charms did nothing to stop the dying. This failure planted the first seeds of doubt in traditional medical thinking. Some city officials began to take practical steps, like quarantining ships for 40 days of practice, that gave us the very word. Quarantine, and isolating the sick in pest houses outside the city walls. These measures, though harsh, sometimes slowed the spread, hinting that disease could be contained through human action rather than divine intervention. Gravediggers and plague doctors became grim symbols of this new era, with their long waxed coats and beaked masks filled with herbs meant to purify the air. Their presence was terrifying but also strangely scientific, an acknowledgement that sickness followed patterns that could be observed and perhaps understood. In time, scholars began keeping more careful records of outbreaks, noting how the disease seemed to follow trade routes and ports, how it struck in waves, and how it faded in the winter only to return again. These observations laid the groundwork for epidemiology centuries before the germ theory of disease was born. Some historians argue that without the Black Death, the scientific revolution might have been delayed, because it was this crisis that forced people to ask sharper questions about the natural world, to doubt ancient authorities, and to experiment with new ideas. Even alchemy and astrology, once tools of superstition, began to transform, giving rise to early chemistry and astronomy as seekers tried to decode the hidden laws of nature. The plague had torn the veil away, exposing a universe where death could strike at random, and humanity had no choice but to search for answers. But this pursuit of knowledge came with a price, for curiosity often clashed with faith, setting the stage for tension between science and religion. In our next section, we will explore how this tension grew, reshaping not only medicine but the spiritual imagination of Europe and preparing the ground for centuries of intellectual conflict. The Black Death struck at the very heart of medieval faith, leaving Europe spiritually shaken, as though the heavens themselves had turned away. Churches that had once been full of hope now echoed with the wails of mourners and the tolling of funeral bells, sometimes ringing without pause as priests blessed grave after grave. For centuries, the Church had been the anchor of meaning, teaching that suffering had a purpose and that prayer could bring deliverance. But as entire parishes were wiped out, even the most devout began to question whether divine mercy still guided the world. Many clergy died ministering to the sick, their sacrifice heroic but their absence devastating, leaving communities without spiritual leadership. Others fled their posts, which some saw as betrayal, further eroding trust. This loss of confidence cracked open a space for new spiritual movements, some seeking deeper purity and others descending into fanaticism. The flagellants, for instance, roamed from town to town, beating themselves in public penance, crying out that humanity must atone for its sins to end the plague. Crowds gathered to watch, some joining in, others recoiling in horror, sensing that this frenzy was more terror than faith. Meanwhile, some mystics claimed visions and revelations, insisting that the end times were near. Fear of God turned into fear of judgment, and with that fear came violence. Jews, lepers, and other minorities were massacred or expelled in an effort to cleanse the land of supposed corruption. Yet, amid the fear and bloodshed, there were also quiet stirrings of reform. Some lay people began to form their own devotional groups, emphasizing personal piety and a direct relationship with God outside the hierarchy of the Church. This hunger for a more personal, less institutional faith would, over time, grow into a powerful force that challenged church authority and contributed to the coming Reformation. The plague had forced people to confront the fragility of life and the seeming silence of heaven, and in doing so, it planted dangerous questions. What if salvation could be sought without priests? What if divine justice was not found in the cathedral but in the conscience? In the next section, we we will follow how these spiritual aftershocks rippled into politics and society, changing not just what people believed, but how they lived, governed, and rebelled in the centuries to come. The political world that emerged after the Black Death was one of instability and reckoning, as if the very idea of power had been shaken loose from its old foundations. The death toll had struck not just peasants and priests, but nobles, knights, and administrators, leaving kingdoms with empty thrones, unclaimed estates, and shattered lines of succession. In some regions, this led to bloody disputes over inheritance, as distant relatives fought to claim land and titles. For rulers who survived, the challenge was stark. They had to reassert control over populations that were fewer, bolder, and far less willing to be ruled as before. The peasantry, suddenly aware of their new leverage, demanded higher wages, better conditions, and even freedom from serfdom. When these demands were denied, unrest boiled over. In France, the Jacquerie Rebellion erupted in 1358, a violent uprising of peasants who burned manors, slaughtered nobles, and sought vengeance for centuries of oppression. In England, decades later, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 shook the monarchy itself, with rebels marching on London and confronting the king face to face. Although these uprisings were eventually crushed, they sent a message that could not be ignored. The old feudal order was crumbling. Kings and princes tried to pass harsh laws, like the Statute of Labourers, to freeze wages and bind workers back to the land, but enforcement was nearly impossible. The plague had created too much scarcity, too much opportunity. In cities, guilds gained influence as skilled artisans became more valuable, and wealthy merchants began to purchase noble titles, blurring the lines between classes. Power was shifting, quietly but inexorably, away from hereditary aristocracy toward those who could command resources and labor. The state itself had to evolve, developing more sophisticated tax systems, bureaucracies, and standing armies to maintain control over a society that was no longer so easily managed. It was as though the Black Death had pressed a reset button on politics, clearing the way for new kinds of governance that would eventually give rise to nations. But every shift in power came with bloodshed and resistance, reminding rulers and ruled alike that the shadow of the plague still hung over them. In the next section, we will turn our focus to the cities themselves, how they were transformed by death, abandonment, and rebirth, and how urban life took on a new and eerie character in the aftermath of so much loss. The cities of Europe became both tombs and testaments in the wake of the Black Death, their narrow streets forever changed by what they had endured. Imagine walking through Florence, Paris, or London in the years just after the plague. Whole districts lay silent, their houses shuttered, grass pushing up between the cobblestones where no one had passed for months. The stench of death had faded, but the memory clung to the walls, a presence you could almost feel pressing against your skin. Survivors had to reclaim these spaces, sweeping out the ashes, rebuilding marketplaces, reopening workshops. But the cities they rebuilt were not the same as before. Many urban areas began to redesign their streets, widening alleys and creating new public wells and fountains in an effort to improve sanitation and prevent future outbreaks. The very shape of the city was a response to the terror they had faced, a silent acknowledgement that disease lurked in filth and closeness. Cemeteries that had overflowed during the height of the plague were expanded, and new charnel houses were built to store bones, their walls stacked high with skulls, grim reminders to every passerby that death had walked here and might return. At the same time, cities became centers of opportunity. With so many gone, property could be bought cheaply, and skilled labor was in demand. Peasants left the countryside to take advantage of higher wages in the towns, fueling a new wave of urban growth. This influx of fresh blood revitalized city life, but it also carried with it a lingering sense of fragility, as if everyone knew that prosperity could be snatched away again at any moment. Guilds and councils gained power, shaping the identity of cities as self-governing communities, and sometimes clashing with kings and princes who sought to control them. Trade began to flow again through ports and market squares, and with it came news, books, and ideas, turning cities into hubs of intellectual and cultural ferment. But the memory of mass graves was never far away, and many cities erected crosses, shrines, and chapels dedicated to the dead, as though trying to keep their spirits appeased. In the next section, we turn from the streets of the living to the burial grounds of the dead, exploring how plague cemeteries, mass graves, and rituals of mourning became some of the most haunting legacies of this dark age. The graveyards of the Black Death became landscapes of silence, places where the earth itself seemed heavy with memory. During the worst years of the plague, burial grounds could not keep pace with the tide of death. In many cities, churchyards overflowed, forcing gravediggers to open mass, pits-long trenches into which bodies were lowered side by side, sometimes layered 3, 4, or 5 deep. Chroniclers described carts rumbling through the streets, piled with the dead like cordwood, escorted only by the hollow toll of a bell. There was no time for prayers, no space for proper funerals, and no distinction between rich and poor. Death had leveled them all. Even centuries later, archaeologists still uncover these plague pits, finding rows of skeletons carefully arranged but hurriedly buried, as if the living had tried to give dignity to the dead even as fear drove them to work quickly. Some cemeteries built ossuaries, charnel houses where bones were collected once flesh had decayed, stacking skulls and femurs into eerie walls that became both practical storage and a spiritual reminder of mortality. The imagery of the memento mori, remember that you must die, grew from this reality, a whisper from the grave urging the living to keep death always in mind. Mourning rituals adapted as well. Entire towns held days of remembrance, and processions carried relics through the streets in hopes of purifying the air. Families who could afford it commissioned masses for the souls of their dead, sometimes endowing perpetual prayers that would be sung for generations. In this way, death became a constant companion, woven into the rhythm of life. Children grew up playing near plague crosses and shrines, seeing them not as morbid but as part of the landscape. The Black Death had given Europe not just scars but monuments, markers of a time when the line between life and death had thinned almost to nothing. These places still speak to us today, their silence a kind of testimony, asking what it meant to survive when so many did not. In the next section, we will follow that question into the homes and hearts of the survivors, exploring how family life, inheritance, and even love itself were reshaped by the empty chairs left behind, inside the homes of survivors. The Black Death left more than silence, it left absence. Like a wound that would never fully close. Tables were set with fewer plates, cradles sat empty, and family names quietly vanished as entire bloodlines were extinguished in a single season. Survivors inherited houses, fields, and wealth they never expected to receive, sometimes so much that they found themselves catapulted from poverty into sudden prosperity. But this inheritance was double-edged. For every coin or acre was a reminder of the brother, the father, the child who had died. Marriage patterns shifted as well. With so many widows and widowers, remarriage became common, often bringing together blended families and altering the structure of households. Young women, now in shorter supply, gained greater bargaining power in choosing their husbands, sometimes marrying for status or advantage rather than merely survival. Love did not disappear, but it took on a new urgency, as though people sensed that life might again be snatched away without warning. Birth rates initially fell, a reflection of grief and fear, but in time they rebounded, as survivors sought to fill the void left by so many deaths. This slow regrowth of population reshaped entire communities, giving rise to a generation sometimes called the children of the plague. Those born into a world marked by loss, but also ripe with opportunity. Family obligations shifted as well, with surviving children suddenly inheriting estates or responsibilities meant for older siblings who were gone. This led to disputes, rivalries, and even feuds over property, as cousins and distant kin contested wills in a world where legal systems struggled to keep pace with so much death. Yet, for all the disruption, there was also a quiet resilience in the way families adapted. Survivors rebuilt their homes, replanted their fields, and retaught their children the rhythms of life, refusing to let the shadow of the plague erase them. It is here, in these intimate spaces, that we see the human spirit refusing to yield completely, even when surrounded by death. And yet, the plague had taught them that survival was never guaranteed, a lesson that would shape the way they thought about fate, fortune, and the meaning of existence. In the next section, we step into the psychological world of these survivors, exploring how fear of recurrence haunted them and how the memory of the Black Death lived on in their dreams, their rituals, and their collective imagination. The Black Death never truly ended for those who lived through. It lived on inside them, shaping their fears, their choices, and even their dreams. Survivors carried an invisible weight, the sense that the world could unravel again at any moment. Some developed a grim fatalism, believing that life was nothing more than a brief pause before death's inevitable return. Others clung to rituals and charms with renewed intensity, hoping to keep disaster at bay. Chroniclers describe how even decades later, when a fever broke out in a village or a rat infestation appeared in a town, panic would sweep through the population as though the plague had never left. People fled at the first sign of sickness, abandoning their homes, sometimes their own relatives, unwilling to endure the horrors they had already seen once. The memory of the pestilence became a ghost that haunted every cough, every rumor of illness, every strange cloud in the sky. Artists and writers turned this fear into symbols, skeletons dancing, hourglasses running empty, graves yawning open. These images were not just morbid decoration, they were warnings, constant reminders to live well because death might be closer than anyone thought. For some, this led to deep piety, an obsession with confession and salvation. For others, it sparked a kind of desperate hedonism, a philosophy of eat, drink, and be merry. For tomorrow we die. This tension between repentance and revelry became one of the defining psychological legacies of the plague years. Parents told their children about the terrible time, passing the memory down like an inherited scar, ensuring that even those who had not lived through it felt its shadow. Entire generations grew up under this spectre, their decisions shaped by the knowledge that catastrophe could strike again. And indeed, it often did, as waves of plague returned in later decades, though never with quite the same ferocity. These recurrences kept fear alive, like a wound that kept reopening just as it began to heal. The Black Death had carved itself into the collective memory of Europe, and its presence could be felt for centuries afterward. In the next section, we will explore how this memory of death and survival began to influence Europe's great turning point, the Renaissance, sparking a search for meaning, beauty, and knowledge that tried to make sense of a world forever marked by loss. Out of the ashes of the Black Death, something unexpected began to bloom, a hunger for meaning, beauty, and knowledge that would ignite the period we now call the Renaissance. It was as if, after staring death in the face for years, Europe had decided to turn toward life with new intensity. Wealth that had once been concentrated in the hands of the old nobility now passed to survivors, including merchants, artisans, and newly enriched peasants who used it to commission art, build churches, and sponsor learning. Cities like Florence became vibrant centers of creativity, their walls adorned with frescoes that celebrated not just saints and martyrs, but the human form itself, rendered with a realism and vitality that had rarely been seen in medieval art. This shift was not merely aesthetic, it was philosophical. Thinkers began to rediscover and translate classical texts from ancient Greece and Rome, searching for wisdom that could help make sense of a world that had seemed to fall apart. Humanism, with its emphasis on human potential and earthly experience, began to challenge the old, purely religious worldview. The memory of the plague gave this movement an edge, a sense of urgency, as though artists and scholars were racing against time to capture the beauty and knowledge of the world before death could claim them too. Even science began to stir, as observers, no longer content with inherited explanations, started to test, measure, and record their observations with greater care. In this way, the Black Death became a strange kind of midwife, birthing a new way of thinking, even as it had destroyed the old order. But the Renaissance was no simple escape from the memory of the plague. It was haunted by it. Many of the masterpieces of the era, from paintings to poetry, carry subtle reminders of mortality, hidden skulls, fading flowers, and dark shadows that whisper that death is always near. This tension between life's radiance and death's inevitability gave the Renaissance its power, making its art and ideas feel urgent and alive. In the next section, we will trace how these changes did not just stay in Italy's city-states, but spread across Europe, fueling revolutions in politics, science, an exploration that would carry the memory of the plague into a new and expanding world. The transformation sparked by the Black Death did not remain confined to the plague-stricken streets of Italy or the frescoed chapels of Florence. It radiated outward, reshaping the entire European continent like ripples on water. The new hunger for knowledge and opportunity collided with a society forever marked by loss, producing a restless energy that drove people to explore, experiment, and expand their horizons. Scientific curiosity began to flourish, no longer satisfied with repeating the teachings of the ancients. Observers studied the stars, charted the movements of the planets, dissected human bodies in search of the secrets of life and death, and wrote treatises that questioned everything from the nature of disease to the workings of the cosmos. Some historians argue that this shift in thinking, the willingness to doubt, to measure, to seek, was a direct consequence of a generation that had watched prayers fail to stop the plague and turned instead to human reason for answers. At the same time, the economic reshuffling caused by the plague had created powerful merchant classes who funded voyages to distant shores, eager to find new trade routes and untapped riches. In this way, the legacy of the Black Death helped lay the groundwork for the age of exploration, sending ships across oceans, and bringing Europe into contact with worlds it had barely imagined. Political power was evolving too, as rulers sought to harness this new wealth and energy, centralizing authority and building the foundations of the modern nation-state. The memory of catastrophe still lingered, acting as both a warning and a spur, reminding society of its fragility while urging it forward into new possibilities. The plague had been a great destroyer, but paradoxically, it had also been a great accelerator, tearing down the old so that something new could rise. And yet, even as Europe entered this era of expansion and discovery, the spectre of the Black Death never fully faded. Plague would return again and again, a shadow that reminded every explorer, every thinker, every monarch that death remained close. In the next section, we turn to these later waves of plague, examining how each recurrence reignited fear and shaped policies, art, and survival strategies, keeping the memory of the great mortality alive for centuries, even as Europe reached toward discovery, invention, and a new sense of human potential. The Black Death was not finished with it. The plague returned in cycles, sometimes striking a town, sometimes sweeping across entire countries, each time reviving the terror of the first great outbreak. These later waves, though less deadly than the original, were no less haunting, for they reminded survivors that the enemy was never fully gone. Bells tolled once more, carts again rolled through the streets, and fear crept back into homes like a cold wind. People learned to live with the threat, but it left a deep psychological scar. Artists continued to paint grim memento mori symbols of death hidden in portraits, skeletal figures lurking at the edges of religious art as if to say, remember, life is brief. Cities developed early forms of public health systems, quarantines, and pest houses where the sick were sent away. But these measures were often brutal and sometimes failed entirely. Entire neighborhoods could be sealed off, leaving the healthy and sick alike trapped together, waiting for the inevitable. Some rulers attempted to impose order through decrees, banning certain markets, closing city gates, or regulating burial practices, but the plague always seemed to slip through. It became a presence that Europeans both feared and strangely accepted, a constant background hum of mortality that shaped everything from the pace of trade to the design of their cities. The recurring outbreaks also deepened Europe's fascination with the macabre. The Danse Macabre motif, with its skeletal dancers leading kings and peasants alike to the grave, became a common theme in art and drama, reminding audiences that death came for all. This morbid imagery was not simply decoration, it was a way for society to process what it had endured, to keep the memory of those who had been lost, and perhaps to ward off the terror by giving it a face. The later plagues, though smaller in scale, made sure that no one could truly believe the danger had passed. In the next section, we will explore how this constant presence of death affected not only Europe's art and architecture, but its faith, philosophy, and view of the human condition itself. Faith, which had once seemed unshakable, was never the same after the plague. In the wake of so much death, Europe's relationship with God grew more complex, darker, and at times defiant. For some, the repeated waves of pestilence were proof that humanity had sinned and was being punished, leading to more fervent devotion, more processions, more prayers, as if to appease a wrathful deity. But for others, the sight of so many faithful men, women, and children perishing despite their piety led to doubt that gnawed at the very foundation of belief. If prayers could not stop the plague, then perhaps the world was not as neatly ordered as the Church had taught. This tension played out in countless ways. Pilgrimages increased, as did the construction of chapels and shrines. But so too did murmurs of heresy, whispers of secret knowledge, and experiments in forbidden sciences. Religious movements arose that challenged authority, arguing that the plague had revealed corruption in the church, that priests who fled the sick had abandoned their sacred duty, that new forms of worship were needed. The flagellant bands of men who whipped themselves in public as an act of penance marched from town to town, frightening rulers and church officials who saw in them a threat to order. The fear of divine punishment was mirrored by fear of witchcraft and the demonic. Witch hunts began to rise in the centuries after the plague, fueled by the belief that someone, somewhere, must be responsible for all this suffering. This atmosphere of both desperate piety and dangerous suspicion left its mark on European philosophy. Thinkers began to wrestle with questions of fate, free will, and the nature of evil, producing works that reflected a new, darker understanding of the human condition. Even those who clung to faith found it tempered by realism, acceptance that death was inevitable and often arbitrary. The plague had stripped away the comforting illusions of safety and control, leaving behind a stark confrontation with mortality. In the next section, we will explore how this confrontation shaped not just Europe's religion and philosophy, but also its approach to medicine, science, and the study of life itself, sparking breakthroughs that would begin to lift the veil on disease. The relentless presence of the plague forced Europe to look at the human body in a new way, setting medicine on a path toward transformation. For centuries, physicians had relied on the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, repeating the old humoral theories that claimed sickness was caused by imbalances of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. But as the plague kept returning, as leeches and prayers failed to save the dying, some began to question whether these ancient explanations were enough. Slowly, a new curiosity took root, a willingness to open the body, to study it not as a symbol of divine order, but as a system that could be understood, mapped, and perhaps even controlled. Dissections became more common, first in secret, then in public demonstrations, where crowds gathered to watch as physicians revealed the hidden structures of muscles, organs, and bones. These were grim spectacles, but they were also revolutionary, breaking taboos and paving the way for a more scientific approach to health. The study of anatomy, spurred by artists like Leonardo da Vinci who sought to capture the body in perfect detail, became an obsession, blending art and science in a quest to uncover nature's secrets. Slowly, theories of contagion began to emerge, challenging the idea that disease was purely a matter of bad air or divine punishment. Some physicians noticed patterns, how the sick infected the healthy, how the disease traveled along trade routes, how quarantine could slow its spread. Though germ theory was still centuries away, these early observations were the seeds of modern epidemiology. Even alchemists and astrologers, though they often worked with mysticism, contributed to a culture that was no longer content with inherited knowledge, but wanted to test, observe, and experiment. The plague, in its terrible way, had forced humanity to ask harder questions, to peel back the layers of superstition and confront the reality of disease with reason and evidence. In the next and final section, we will look at how the Black Death's shadow stretches even into the present day, how the lessons it taught about survival, medicine, and human fragility continue to shape our world, and why this event, centuries past, still speaks to us with such unsettling power. The Black Death may have ended centuries ago, but its shadow still lingers, stretching across history to reach us even now. It is in the way we build our cities, with their wide streets and sanitation systems meant to keep disease at bay. It is in our medicine, our hospitals, and our insistence on understanding the causes of illness rather than simply accepting them as fate. It is even in the way we think about life itself, how precious it is, how fleeting, how easily it can be taken away. The plague left Europe smaller, poorer, and scarred, but it also left it restless, creative, and unwilling to remain unchanged. Out of its terror came quarantines, medical observation, public health systems, and a new curiosity that would eventually lead to the scientific revolution. Out of its grief came some of the most haunting art and literature ever produced. Works that still speak to us of death's certainty and life's urgency. And out of its destruction came an unspoken understanding that humanity must adapt or perish, must learn or be swept aside. In this way, the Black Death is not just a story of suffering, but a story of transformation. It reminds us that catastrophe can be both an ending and a beginning, a crucible in which entire civilizations are reshaped. When we face pandemics today, the echo of the 14th century is unmistakable. The masks, the quarantines, the fear of strangers carrying invisible threats, these are not new inventions, but old memories stirred awake. And perhaps that is why the Black Death still fascinates us, still unnerves us. It forces us to look at the fragility of the systems we depend on, to see how quickly life can unravel, and to ask ourselves what we would do if the world turned silent again. Would we find the same resilience, the same drive to create, to seek knowledge, to rebuild? Or would we be crushed beneath the weight of fear as so many were before us? The story of the Black Death is not only about the past, it is a mirror held up to the present, whispering that history may sleep, but it never truly dies.